afternoon, everybody. Have you been having a great time? And I want to say good afternoon also to our online audience. Thank you so much for taking wherever you are, wherever you're sitting, deciding to take that magical flight and enter into Macondo with us. You too are Macondo citizens. Thank you for joining us. Macondo citizens, are we happy to have Aminatta Forna with us or what? Aminatta, it seems you're a very, very popular part of Macondo. I don't know if you knew that you've become a citizen.
Oh, well, I'm very glad to be a citizen. And I hope, I get the keys to the city as well.
Oh, okay, we will arrange that. Not the keys to Nairobi. I'm not sure you want the keys to Nairobi, but Macondo definitely. How are you enjoying the festival?
Oh, I'm having a fantastic time. Thank you very much. Yeah, I'm having a super time. I feel like we've all been in a cage for a while, haven't we, with COVID and with all sorts of things. And this is the first festival I've attended since that particular crisis. I published the window seat, slap bang in the middle of it, and so I ended up doing a tour of a book about travel from my office chair. So this is the first time I've actually got out to speak about it, and I couldn't be more delighted, I can tell you.
And we will be talking about the book, but it says Notes from a Life in Motion. So I'm now just thinking of all the people, COVID must have been really difficult for you.
It was a prison sentence.
And is this your first time in Nairobi?
No, it's not my first time in Nairobi. I came here, first of all, for a literary festival, Story Mojo, organized by Tony Garland. And I fell in love with Kenya. We had a festival in Nairobi, and then they took us up to Lamu for a short retreat. And that was when I fell in love with the country. So I was delighted. I've been back many times since, and I'm back again.
Shout out, I don't know if Mudhoni is in here already, but yes, she is. Mudhoni, thank you so much for creating such a great experience that she fell in love and has kept coming. We really appreciate you and the work that you do as well. And we will come to this, but I know also in the essay, it was so exciting for me to turn the page and see Kenya is there, very much in the book. And those of you who bought the book will know that. Well, we're going to start our conversation. I sent a message to Aminatta and just said to her, I've been talking to you much longer than you can imagine. And when you're writing to someone for the first time, I thought I'll get back an email saying, who is this person? But honestly and sincerely, both through her books and both through, especially the one we are talking about, we will be talking about Aminatta Forna. The session is Aminatta Forna's Window Seat. My name is Mshai Mwangola. And as I said, I get to have the absolute privilege, I can't describe it in any other word, to represent all of you by holding the space for the conversation that we are going to have. Those of you who are online, we will make sure that we will come to you. So if you have any questions, please, you can put them in the chat and we will make sure that we have a time when we'll gather those questions as well. But today we are sitting on the window seat and we'll be talking through the notes from a life in motion, the life being Aminatta Forna. And what I'd like to do is, instead of doing the normal introduction, I'll be introducing you as we go through the session. But I do want to say this, and I want to thank the hosts at Macondo Literary Festival. Please, 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 even if you have the program, do yourself a favor, go onto the website, look at the Festival 2023, Disrupting Home, go and look at the bios, click on where you see Aminatta Forna's beautiful face. And not only will you get the bio, but you'll also get some links to her website, some conversations with other people. I promise you, that's a gift I'm giving you for free. Aren't I a good Kenyan? Karibuni nyumbani, I've begun with a gift. But you will be getting to know her a whole lot better as we speak. And so Aminatta, the life in question, in brief. I think of myself as somebody who's traveled, but goodness me. Born in Scotland, raised in Sierra Leone and Great Britain, spent periods of her childhood in Iran, Thailand, and Zambia, and you've never stopped since then. So I want to just talk a little bit about that. You start us off by taking us to the window seat. And the window seat isn't like most of us, when we grow up and we say, for whatever reason, it's time to leave home. You almost have, home has been being on the window seat or being in motion right through. And I just want to start by saying, what was that like? What is it like? And you may say, actually, I don't know any other life. But for you, when you hear the rest of us speaking and thinking very much, I've been listening all through the festival, and from day one, you said, I don't have roots. I have legs. And you talked about, you were one person who seemed to be always pushing back on this notion of home as one place that you go back to every so often. And for many of us, it's really hard to imagine. We go like, oh, poor child. She didn't have a home. Ah, maskini. What is it like for you? Do you think of yourself and say, poor me?
Do I think of myself as homeless?
Yes.
Look, it's lovely to see you all there. Fish don't know the water's wet. I can't, I don't know what else to say. Fish don't know the water's wet. But I was raised by people who thought globally. My mother grew up, she's Scottish, she grew up in a small town, and all she ever wanted to do was get out of it. And she is the most itinerant person I have ever met. She honestly makes me look like I'm standing still. She has lived in multiple countries. She's lived an exciting and adventurous life. And my father was the same. He came from a small village in Sierra Leone, and he did what nobody else in the village had done. He won scholarships, and he won a place to study medicine in Scotland, and then continued to live a life in which his entire thoughtscape was global. So I think I inherited it from them, the idea that you could have more than one home, that nothing was fixed. But also I've really been thinking about it when I saw that the theme of the festival was disrupting home. I came with that plan in mind because I have spent my life as a writer constantly being asked, or just as an individual, where is home? Where is home? Where is home? And I got to a point where I'm thinking, if I'm not troubled about this, why are you so troubled? Right? What is it to you where my home is? But I spent a long time thinking about it, and then in the end I wrote an essay called Heim, which is Scottish for home, because I was inspired by the story of my grandmother, who's a person, the only one I know, but I'm sure it happens, who attempted to emigrate and failed. So she went to live in Canada at a time when the Scots people in particular, but also the Irish and the Welsh, were sort of encouraged to leave, and it was called assisted immigration, and they were encouraged to basically go and live in countries that colonial countries. And she lasted a year, and she came home again, and then she became more and more and more. Her world became tighter and tighter and tighter, and by the time I knew her as a child, she was completely agoraphobic, and she wouldn't leave the house, let alone the country. So I actually wrote Heim because I was completely fascinated by people who are what I home homestruck. Right, they begin to. They love their home, that's a wonderful thing, but they actually become uneasy when they're separated from it. And I really began to look at the idea of homesickness, and that homesickness was once a disease, classified as a disease and treated, and doctors 100 or 150 years ago began to realize that these people who were languishing, the cure for them was to send them back home again. Now, I suppose you can live like that, but I didn't particularly wish to. And I also thought, how do those people, what happens to them when home becomes disrupted? And home will become disrupted because it becomes disrupted by time. You can stay still, but home will become disrupted by time.
I am okay, this is why I love reading and talking to you, because now my mind is going all over the place. And part of me wants to go to that essay of home. So I'm going to go there, even though I had wanted to start with the essay, the title one, the window seat. And I'll tell you why I want to go there. One of the things that for me is so interesting, and as you know, your mother is fascinating. And I'm glad that, I said, okay, she and Obama are thinking a lot alike, because you've dedicated this particular book to your mother, whom, if you think about the life of your father, which you have shared with us, your mother seems to be, she's the background person. And then you meet her in this book all over, and she's completely fascinating. And as you say, she's all over the place. But then you have your grandmother, who is, and this essay is about thinking about this space that your grandmother was in, went away and chose to come back home. And then you also have this character who has moved into my head and doesn't want to go anywhere in the essay Crossroads, who is of your line, Yabeas, am I saying that correctly?
Yabeas.
And she's somebody who is uprooted from her home, where she's born and brought up, really doesn't have a choice about it, goes elsewhere, and at a point decides, I want to go back there. And that's one of the most powerful stories. Even the way you choose to end it is so powerful, because you have her being, finally saying, you must give me a choice, and I am making a choice, and that is it. And there's something powerful, because at that point you're talking about crossroads, but you're also going back to this notion of what women do and the many choices women make to do with home. And it's all within this one lineage that is represented by you. And then, of course, you're all over the book. Can you talk to us a little bit about this notion of, and I like that you chose to use this word, hame, which for me destabilizes my notion of home. Yet all these women, I think I know them. They're not my mother, my grandmother, and yet they're women I know. And then you made me wonder about so many women whose lives I've never thought about. So, thinking about hame, thinking about women, thinking about the places we occupy, and the way in which we make home or don't make home, or reject home, or do all that, including yourself.
Well, Yabeas, you may know if you've read The Devil That Danced on the Water, but may not recall, was my great-great-grandmother on my Sierra Leonean side, and she was the daughter of a man called Masamunta Akake, which meant King Great Beard. I had a big beard, presumably, and the area in which he ruled was overrun by warriors during certain wars in Sierra Leone in the 1890s. And she was enslaved and given to the warlord as a gift, as part of the peace negotiations. And so she went to live with him, who became my great-great-grandfather, Pa Malai. And she lived with him, and she had 3 children. And then at some point, she began to try to effect her escape, to get away from him and get away from the place she was, to get back home. And she did it in rather a remarkable way. I'm not sure I want to give the spoiler, but she did it in an extraordinary way. And this story has come down the family through many, many, many generations, the story of Yabeas and how she managed to return back to Temne land from the place where she had been taken. But she was redeemed as a slave. She found a way to be redeemed as a slave, because slavery in Sierra Leone came with a law of redemption, and the person who owned you had no right once those conditions had been fulfilled. You were free whether they wanted it or not. So Yabeas manages this, and she goes back to Temne land. And actually, I have there is a circle in all of this, through all the women in my life, which is actually, I have an extremely close relationship with the town, with the little village that Yabeas came from. It is called Rabonko. It is a place I go to a lot. It's a place where I've built a school and established a farm. Mine's actually cashews, but my grandfather's was coffee. But these were projects that we started after the war. But in a way, you know, I mean, I've absolutely have come full circle. I've sort of been around the world and come back again. Not that I grew up in Rabonco, but to me it has a very, very strong relationship. And it's kind of fascinating, because I was thinking about some of the answers that people gave about home in our opening night. And one of them was, where even dead people recognize you. That was Hemley Boom said, at home was where even the ghosts recognize you. And when I go to Yabias's village, I can be many miles from that village, and I can be, like, for example, here's what happened once. I was stopped by a policeman, and the policeman was giving me a hard time. And we all know why, you know, because wanted a bribe. And so a passerby, as Sierra Leoneans are a little bit nosy sometimes, had a look to see what was happening. And he went to the policeman, you know, that's Paroque's daughter and granddaughter. And that's, you know, he's talking about my grandfather who died in 1972, right? As soon as he said that, the policeman stopped treating me like a stranger and started to treat me like a local, and you know, and also dropped, you know, the road we were on towards trying to get a bribe from me. But it's kind of fascinating to me that, you know, orally, that still is very much my home, and I'm still very attached to the stories of it. It is simply that it is one of my homes now.
Could you say something about writing these very different women? What is it like to, you know, because you do that very well. When you're talking about one, I feel her, yet they're so different. So what is the process for you of, these are not fictional characters. You cannot just imagine them. You talked about the first day, yesterday, about one of the things you enjoy doing is inhabiting. But these are actual real people. Your mother, your grandmother, you cannot, you know, suddenly make your mother, she can't be Irish and Zambian suddenly. She's who she is. Could you take us a little bit into writing that?
Let me have a think. I mean, I spent a lot of time with them, and with Yabias, I went and lived her life. I would say that life in the village is very unchanged from the 1890s. Actually, not much has changed. So I spent months in the village, living her life and interviewing women who, if not exact contemporaries of hers, then certainly kind of had overlapping lives and knew how that world worked. And I would ask them every question I could think of. And when you're talking to people who haven't been represented in fiction, one of the most delightful things is the way in which they will share anything with you. You know, so as I'm sort of crossing over into ancestor stones now, because that was a work of fiction, but you know, I was able to reconstruct large parts of what Yabias's life was like by talking to women who remembered times that were, you know, very, very similar to those. And I could ask them any question, you know, what was it? Okay, what did you wear on your wedding day? How did you do makeup in those days? Were you frightened of childbirth? How did you get out of marriages you didn't want to be in? What did you think the first time you were given the vote? You know, all of these things. And what I found was that these women had incredible agency. It didn't look like choice the way NGOs write it up. Right, but they had incredible agency, and they managed to live lives. They managed to live full lives, and they managed to live interesting lives, and very often happy lives, because they were able to take agency for themselves where they saw it. So, and with my grandmother, my Scottish grandmother, you know, I talked to a lot of people. I knew her anyway, but I talked to a lot of people around her. I spoke to my grandfather at great length about what he thought had happened to her when she left Canada and went back to Scotland. And he said he thought she was homesick. He said, I think it was as simple as that. She was homesick. And, you know, I spent a lot of time in Scotland. I went back to the villages where we'd originally come from on the islands, and northerly islands. And again, with my mother, you know, well, I observe her very closely. But I think with my mother, as often happens with mothers and daughters, you know, you grow up and you begin to understand them a lot better than you did when you were younger. So I think I grew, you know, I grew up in parallel with her and began to see her as another woman as opposed to my mother.
And I want to go back to the window seat. So these are the memories of other people, and you are able to excavate them and write them. And what I love, so apart from the fact that I also am a window seat person, I do not mind being squashed in for the whole flight because I want to spend my time looking out. I really loathe not getting a window seat and having to be in the aisle. And I think it's a beautiful metaphor for observing things. But one thing I loved about that, especially that title essay, and other essays like the one in Iran, where you take us back to being a child or to being much younger, is I really feel I am back there in the body of a child. You're very good at, it's a memory, but it feels real to that time and to that place. And it's not like, okay, now I'm going to tell you when I was young, and this is what, but I can hear the adult telling me about the child. Again, I want to go back to writing. How do you do this? It's not it seems so easy, but it's not an easy thing.
I don't think I ever stopped being a child. I think that's possibly quite why. I mean, I spend a lot of time thinking about it. I take time. I mean, I think when you write, you simply have to give yourself a huge amount of space. When people ask me about writing, I say give up the day job. I give the opposite advice to most young writers. I say give up the day job because it takes time, and you have to spend time with those thoughts, those ideas, whether it's a fictional plot or an essay. It takes time, and I think about these things all the time. I'm never not thinking about them. And it's kind of how this essay collection came together. In fact, I'm going to read a little bit, but it's how the essay collection came together because I can't not write. Well, I can't not think. And because writing helps me think, I can't not write. And so when my agent began to notice that I was I'd finish a book and then I'd get a little bit kind of, well, what am I going to do now? And he said to me, just why don't you write some nonfiction, write an essay? And so I began to write these essays as palate cleansers between novels, right? Between big pieces of work, I would write an essay or two and publish it. And then I'd get on to something bigger and then longer, and then I'd come back and write a couple of essays just to give myself some breathing space. But it's also sort of where I tested a lot of ideas, things I was still thinking about. And eventually, at some point, a couple of years ago, one of my editors said, you've got a collection here. And so we put together the essays that had already been published, and then I wrote some specifically for the window seat. And so those ones are newly published in the window seat. So that's how this essay collection came together. I think we did talk about doing a little bit of reading. Can I read?
Yes, and actually somebody's silent. Okay, no, I thought I'd been silenced, which is a hard thing to do. I was actually going to ask that next, but before you say that, I was going to say one thing about your body of work that fascinates me, and then I wanted to ask about the essays. So you've answered that question, but you've written memoir, you've written short stories, you've written novels, and then you've written essays, and you've been a journalist. And so my question was going to be about how you came to saying it's time to do a book of essays, but also, I guess my question for you is there a favorite space for particular times? Or, and you've answered that the essays for you are, I'm in between projects, or I need to just take a bit of time from the novels and come back to it. Yeah. Can you comment on that in relation to your other forms of writing? We were talking earlier about the other person who does that is Marquez, who had to show up because we're at Macondo. So he was like, this is how I'm coming in. But how do you think about this thing of being able to move from one to the other?
Well, Marquez was a big influence on me, not stylistically, but in terms of his breadth. And I will admit, I'm not the biggest fan of magical realism. So it wasn't really, love in the time of cholera that attracted me so much. The book of Marquez's that I absolutely was smitten by was News of a Kidnapping, in which he reconstructs 4 kidnappings that took place in Colombia in the 1970s and what they meant individually, personally, and politically. Marquez wrote all kinds of things. He wrote short stories, he wrote essays, he wrote narrative journalism, he wrote magical realism, huge novels, small novels. He wrote memoir as well. He wrote all kinds of things. So I was always, I kind of lucked out a bit, because when I first started writing, there was a convention that you chose one lane and you stayed in it, right? If you were a fiction writer, that's what you did. And I started off writing memoir, and I remember the publisher saying to me, well, do you have another memoir? And I thought, about what? Also, if you had said that at the beginning, I'd have passed it out. About what? And so I just thought, no, I'm going to write a novel. And my agent was great, actually, because he just said, oh, write what you want. We'll never say what it is, he said. We'll never say exactly what it is. Let them think what they like, but write what you want. And so I wrote a novel. And then along came other things, more novels. And I was in a period of really feeling that fiction was it. And I do think, there's this phrase, saying, and I know if you look it up on the internet, you will see it ascribed to me. I have to admit, it was not me. This is what I love about the internet. It lies. It was not me, but the saying is, and I think it was Nadine Gordimer, the saying is, non-fiction reveals the lies, but only metaphor can tell the truth. Now, I put non-fiction at a somewhat higher level than that. I think there are all sorts of wonderful creative non-fiction, but the point is that there are 2 different purposes for each one. And so sometimes when I have an idea, I know that it is going to work in non-fiction, and other times I know that the vehicle has to be fiction. When I think of non-fiction, I think of Picasso's works. I think of the bulls. Picasso painted and sculpted bulls all the time, and there's, there are endless Picasso paintings of a bull, but there's a sculpture that he made, and it is of a bicycle seat and a bicycle handlebar, and he's put the handlebar here, and he's put the seat there, and it makes a bull. And so when I think of non-fiction, I think of that. It's a found story. So Picasso found those pieces and made a work of art out of it. And with non-fiction, the story is something that I have found, and that it comes wholly formed. And there are essays in here that are like that. They came wholly formed. I happened across somebody, something, some place, and there was the story. I didn't need to fictionalize anything. There's another kind of essay, which is the polemical essay, and you'll find those in there too. That's just when I'm in a steaming rage about something, and I've just got to get it off my chest. But generally speaking, I think of a memoir, for example, as a found story, and many of the essays are found stories.
So do take us to a found story.
Well, here is the opening essay of the window seat. It's just fun. Let me read it. So the opening essay is all about flying, okay? You've probably got that. Mostly as a passenger, but here's where I do something different. When I was in my mid-20s and still immortal, I took the controls of a light aircraft and looped the loop 3 times. It remains one of the best things I've ever done. My first loop was imperfect. I was so excited. I barely heard the crashing while we were upside down, which was the sound of every loose object falling from its place. I also did not compute the sudden silence as we glided onward. I'd taken the plane out of 0 gravity and stalled the engine. Paul, my friend, mentioned this as if in passing. I said, so now we're flying without an engine. The plane appeared to have lost no height. We were not spiraling earthward. He leant forward and turned the ignition. I said, can I have another go? We'd spent the last 40 minutes performing aerobatic maneuvers. We'd flown figures of 8 and barrel rolled and dived. We'd looped the loop both ways, inside and out. Below me, I could see the mouth of the Orwell River and the Orwell Bridge, which we'd driven across the day before. My only job as passenger was to enjoy the ride and to act as lookout. Look right, look left, look up, look down. Are there other planes? No. Spin, climb, dive, roll. It was as simple as that. After a while, though, I started feeling queasy. I tried looking at the horizon, but it was never in the same place. Paul said he would take me back, but I wasn't ready for that. So he offered me the controls, because the pilot never gets airsick. To loop the loop, you must first get the plane up to a certain speed, around 140 miles an hour. Keep the wings perfectly level. Find something to line the nose of the aircraft up to that will help you navigate. I used the Orwell Bridge. Then you pull the joystick firmly but slowly towards your belly. The nose of the aircraft starts to rise as the plane begins the first 180-degree turn. It feels like taking a heavy car up a too steep hill. At any moment, you might begin to slide backwards. You're pressed into your seat by the force. Now you're upside down. And this is the tricky bit. You need to ease off the stick so the plane floats over the arc of the loop before you begin the return journey, at which point you begin to push the joystick away. The second time I looped the loop, I made the same mistake as the first. Well, it was so very hard to keep it all going upside down, to keep looking and thinking and doing. The third time, which was to be the last, because Paul thought people watching from the clubhouse might start to ask why he was flying so amateurishly, I executed my loop proficiently. Every item in the cockpit, including the packet of Marlboros on the dash, stayed in its place for the entire 360-degree rotation. I flew out of the loop, my wings level, feeling like the gymnast who has just dismounted the beam, having scored a perfect 10. And now I'll read another essay in its entirety, if you'll bear with me. And this is what I think of as a found story. This essay is entitled In Timbuktu. It's also where the picture on the front of the book was taken. And people say to me, "What beach are you on?" Which really annoys me, because I was in the middle of the Sahara Desert. Anyway, in Timbuktu. In Timbuktu, I stopped a man to ask him the way to the post office. The man had a question of his own, which he wanted answered first. "Is it true," he said, "that in Britain people have a thing about Timbuktu?" "Yes," I said. "People think it's far away, like the farthest place on earth." At this, the man laughed for a long time, and then he gave me directions to the post office.
Thank you very much. There is a metaphor there. I love the story of the loop. It's like writing. This earlier on, we were having a conversation with Kerry Baraka and a few others about what it is like to write your first book, then your second book, and so on. So I really love that. I wonder if any of you have questions. I have still so many questions, but I really would like to see hands up for questions. I can see one. Okay, we'll start with that one, and then I'll also come to the questions that are in the audience. As the mic gets there, can I just throw out a quote to you from the book? And by the time it gets there, you'll also get that question. This one has just stayed with me. "I have long been interested in beginnings, to trace things back to the first flap of the butterfly wings that culminate in the hurricane." Could you say a little bit more about that, and then we'll go to that question.
Who here was the kind of kid that always asked why? But why? But why? Until your mother or father wanted to give you a slap. I was that kind of kid. I mean, I just wanted to know why. And also that nothing was really by coincidence, I began to learn later on in life. Things didn't just happen, people made them happen, right? Or events made them happen, natural events perhaps. But on the whole, people made things happen. And I began to learn that. And the first book, my memoirs, is written about the murder of my father. He was killed when I was 11. He was a political prisoner for many years. He stood up to a dictatorship and paid the price for that. And The Devil That Danced on the Water was about retracing everything that had happened to him that I remembered as an 11-year-old, because I was there the day he was arrested. So I write everything that happened in as much as I remembered of my father in the first 11 years, and the book is split in 2 halves. And then the second half is as an adult going back and tracing exactly why it happened and what some of those things I saw meant. And I think it's why I began as a journalist, because I was so endlessly curious. And journalism didn't suit me at all. I sort of thought it was a way of writing and getting paid, which was not entirely incorrect. I did get paid, but what I really couldn't tolerate about being a journalist, I was a BBC journalist, a television reporter for many years, was the fact that I was speaking in somebody else's voice. Right? I was speaking in somebody else's voice, and the BBC corporation, that's the voice of white Middle England, and that is not my voice. And I would do a lot of, the way it worked was you reported on your programs from September through June, just like the school year, and then in the summer you were able to make documentaries, but you had to pitch these ideas to the commissioners. And I really, I wanted to make documentaries set in the African continent. And I would just face this endless resistance to the idea. And then when we did manage to get I did manage to get the idea off the ground, there would be all this having to explain to this Middle England audience, where Timbuktu was, for example. I made a documentary called The Lost Libraries of Timbuktu. It was the last thing I did. Still goes out on BBC World Service. I made it in 2008. People ring me up and they say, "But you look so youthful." I say, but what was the question?
We were tracing the butterfly from wings to the hurricane.
Why things happen. So, and that has endlessly been my quest. And I think every single one of my books is always really fundamentally about why things happen, how they happen, and why they happen. And only when we understand that can we begin to make change. Right? Things don't just happen. Someone makes them happen, and we can all make things happen.
Thank you. So you have the mic? Yes.
Hello. Thank you so much for taking time to share your story with us, your experiences. I just wanted to ask...
May I ask your name, please?
Oh, sorry. My name is Mo. Spelled M-U, not M-O-O. People make that mistake.
My son is called Mo, M-O.
Thank you.
I did write my first novel with my heart in my mouth. I think with the memoir I knew more or less what I was doing because I'd been a journalist. But fiction is so different and so difficult that I really would wake up every morning with this sort of sense of panic. But I'd had this funny conversation with a friend of mine at the BBC who was also a writer and a journalist. And we were talking about writing a book. And one of our colleagues, much to our annoyance, had gone off and written a book and was getting some attention in the press. And we sat there jealously, and my friend said to me, turned around to me and he went, he said, all he did was do it. I never forgot that, right? All he did was do it. So I went off and I thought, just do it. Right? Just get it done, get it on paper, create the book. And there's always the possibility, there's always the possibility with the first book that, you can still go back. I don't know, whatever you were doing before, if you feel, and a lot of people do go back after the first book. I'm often asked the question, why is the second book so difficult? And I say, well, they're all difficult. They're all difficult. And then the journalist gets annoyed and says, that's not what I meant. answer the question. And I say, well, the first book is it's difficult in its own way, but people usually, they have their mental energy and the dedication, and they've got an idea they've been thinking about for years and years, and they get it on paper. But when it comes to the second book, they can't go back into that room. They can't lock themselves away for 2 years and live with people who don't exist. And that is why the second book very often doesn't come at all, and if it does come, it's very difficult. And I've seen a lot of friends of mine who have started as writers then decide, actually, do you know what? That was fine, but somebody else can do it now. So it's, you know, I mean, we all try things in life, don't we? I'll give you a more practical piece of advice now, though, which is, I think it is worth, and this is something I say to my students, treat your career as a business. Right. Don't think that with the first book you're going to be a big hit, and you know, and the papers really don't help with this, or the media doesn't help with this. We all hear about the, you know, 15-year-old who gets the $1 million advance. That doesn't really happen, right? Think of it as a business. Write a book, write another book, write another book. Keep building on your books, and gradually things begin to come. Right, but you just have to keep going. It's a long haul. It's a marathon. It's not a sprint, right? And if you haven't managed to be the enfant terrible, then you have to go for éminence grise, which is what I'm doing.
What you just said, last year we had the absolute privilege of having Abdulrazak Gurna. And he's, I think, just the model, you know, if you need someone to remind you just to keep going and not worry about the first book did not make me a superstar. Mm-hmm. And at the point where you think, well, the books are out there and, you know, the small number of people who have read it, that's good enough. The world suddenly says, oh my goodness, look at what you've done. And I think that's such an amazing, what you just said.
It's such a great thing that happened to Abdul Razak, because I'd known him for a little while, and actually I was really pleased because I used to blurb his books, and so when he got the Nobel, I had on the front of it, you know, whatever I said by Aminatta Forna, and I was like, ah. But we had the same publisher, and she had just retired, or she was on the point of retiring, and some newspaper article had come out, and this is why you really have to ignore newspaper articles. A newspaper article came out, and it was all about the post-colonial writers. Was sort of stood on that. It was what I thought. Are we still on that? Anyway, it was about the post-colonial writers, and they had this array of, you know, new young things. And she wrote on Facebook, she said, I have championed Abdul Razak Gurna for 30 years. And she said, and yet another article comes out and they have ignored him yet again. And she said, sometimes the heart gives up hope. And the very next week, the Nobel announcement came.
Okay, any other question? I only had, one hand. Okay, I'll come back to you for another chance. But while we do that, is there a hand there?
Oh, don't be shy.
Don't be shy. Okay. I'll give you a chance to think about it. I did want to ask this. So we said we would focus on writing and not on, I mean, the ideas in this book are amazing. So we could go, I have a question for almost every essay, which is going into the politics, but I want us to more or less stay on writing, except that we must talk about, because Kenya comes up in this book. And you have an essay on Barack Obama and the Renaissance generation. I had never, ever thought about the group of that generation that went out and then came back. And it was, I'm going to just read this. I think you say it so beautifully. The generation of Africans to whom the task fell of creating new countries knew or came to know that alongside the desires and the dreams and the promise of newfound freedom, they had been set up to fail. The real courage lay in the fact that they did not surrender, that they tried to do what they had promised themselves and their countries they would. They went forward anyway. Could you talk a little bit more about that?
Well, I mean, the essay is about those of us who are children of the Renaissance generation. And I focused, for the reasons that my father was one of them, on the ones, the many who were sent to study in typically Great Britain. But then as things began, as global politics began to change to East Germany, then Russia, then China. But my father was part of the generation that went to Britain, and Obama's father was part of the Kenyan, the airlift that went to America. And that was really about Kenya's relationship with Britain and the rise of Mau Mau. And Britain basically refused to give Kenyan scholarships. It was a punishment. And so America stepped in and said, well, okay, you know, I mean, it's a long story, and you'll read it in the essay collection, but essentially America stepped in where Britain failed. So I became really fascinated by their lives. Ngugi wa Thiong'o was one of them. Sorry, I'm having a brain freeze on the Nobel winner who planted trees here. She also was one of them. Yeah. I just became fascinated by their whole experience, and I guess, you know, I'd always really assumed that what they did was born of youthful courage, that the courage one only finds in youth, and especially having been given so often the question of, you know, well, what happened to Africa? You know, wow, you know, you got independence, and then what happened to Africa? And you know, so I spent a lot of time thinking about this, and as though it was, you know, these countries were not run by a corrupt regime before independence, right? You know, it's not like they were run as democracies under colonialism, so we can drop that. But I was really fascinated by that generation and the task that they had been handed and what they chose to do with it. And they didn't, you know, when I realized that they knew that there was a con at the center of the whole enterprise, I just thought, wow, that is, you know, they weren't innocents. They absolutely knew that the task that they had been set was, if not impossible, then very, very difficult. And earlier on this stage, we heard one of the speakers, Kalap from Angola, talk about patience. And I heard him, and I thought, this is absolutely what we need to do is to have patience. It has been an extremely short time since independence, and you know, things are going to take a great deal of time. And some of us, I don't expect to be around to see all of those changes. It may take another 100 years, it may take another 200 years, but what I have really observed, you know, we've talked a lot in this festival as though everything in Europe is fine. But I mean, Europe is in decline. Europe is in serious decline, and America is in free fall. Right? So whatever things look like here, you know, we must remember, we must contextualize it and think about what things are like everywhere else. Everybody in the world is very anxious, or everybody who has a conscience in the world is very anxious at the moment. And so things will take time. And we also must recognize that we are working with very imperfect structures, and it is our job to try to change that. And one of the other things that was said on this stage, and I don't want to go too far into the politics, we'll get back to the writing, but one of the things that was said on the stage was this beautiful metaphor of the hummingbird that tries to put out the fire. Yusuf Abdel from Morocco, this hummingbird, you know, just taking drops and trying to put out a fire. And it is, that is each of ours role. When I was a child, the very last thing my father wrote for me in a little autograph book that I had got for Christmas, he wrote, "Honor and shame on no condition lie, act well, on no condition rest, act well your part, for there the honor lies." And it is about acting well our part. No one of us can do it all. There is no savior, right? But it is simply about being the hummingbird and acting well our part.
which is also a favorite story of Wangari Maathai. And, I'm thinking Wangari, Yusuf, your father, all of these were part and are part of this Renaissance generation. And then I think of Frantz Fanon, each generation must, out of relative obscurity, discover its own mission. And then the judgment on whether you failed or you succeeded. And I think in their ways in which they were set up to fail, and so they failed, and their ways in which they succeeded.
Yeah, they succeeded because they created us and we carried it on.
Yes. And I also just want to say there's a wonderful essay, we won't unpack it here. But what I loved about it is you talk about your father in the Renaissance generation and the chosen ones, the big names that we know. And then you have this amazing man called Santigi, who is also part of the same generation, isn't the big name, the people who are doing the big things, but in his own way. And the line that for me, I think I actually closed the book and the tears came, was when you said, he kept visiting your father when your father had been imprisoned. When, that's the time everybody disowns you. And you say, his visits to my father were an act of loyalty, of courage, and an act of resistance. And later on you say, he reminded the authorities that my father was not forgotten. I think there are so many men and women like that who just keep on turning up every day, doing what is right. And it doesn't matter if everybody else is not doing it, but they're there. Now, this is something you write a lot about. You want us to pay attention to the things you're doing today that don't look like they matter now, but they 30, 40, 50 years later. Why is this so important to you that you want us to keep remembering this?
Well, I think I was born or given an overwhelming sense of duty. I mean, I think life comes with responsibility, and it is up to each of us to fulfill that responsibility. And I think it's as simple as that, actually. It is the way I was raised. It's what my father taught me. It is what my Sierra Leonean family have taught me. That life comes with responsibility. And I suppose it's, like many of you, I'm part of a very big extended family. And so the more you do well in the world, the more responsibility you take for the family. And some people decide they don't want that responsibility and they run away. And they have to run away to the West and change their phone number because it's quite hard to get away from it sometimes. But to me, it's part of that part of life comes responsibility. And the only ways in which, put it this way, everything that my father and family did is the reason that I am sitting here. Every choice they made for us. And you know how in our families, I think it still goes on, but it certainly went on a lot in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s. A child who was doing well at school would be chosen, and everybody would contribute a little bit of money to send that child to school. And that is the most astonishing collective spirit. And we now live in an age where we are being encouraged towards kind of Western individualism. And I wonder what will be lost the more that we decline that duty. And I do understand that the duty can be onerous. And I also understand that people can take advantage of it, because believe me, there are members of my family that do. But, it is a matter, things only become better if we all play our part. I'm coming back to the same thing, but things only become better if we all play our part.
This is the last call for one last question, if anybody has a question. We took about 5 minutes to start, and therefore I'm going to steal 5 minutes and not look at my stage manager. Yes, please. Do we have anything online? Any question online?
Good evening, my name is Andrew.
Hello, Andrew.
My question is on your approach in terms of research. When you're doing, so for instance, you say that you went to Sierra Leone. So when you're undertaking research, so is it, what language are you using? Is it English when you're speaking to the contemporaries of your grandmother? Is it through English, or what language are you communicating with? And would you be afraid that there is something that
great question. Can I just piggyback on that? And if you're working with different languages, I know you mentioned Temne earlier, what's the process?
Okay, thanks very much for that question. I grew up not speaking Timni, which is my family language, for the reason that we were exiled. And I was taken away from the language. But also, I think, as my parents were very stuck on English, they wanted us to be global citizens. They wanted us to go to university in the West. So Creole, which is the lingua franca in Sierra Leone, was discouraged at home. It was Timni or English. And then, as I say, we were exiled, and I lost the opportunity to speak in English, Timni. Although I did say, I spoke to my stepmother, and I said, why didn't you teach us Timni? And she said, well, we thought you'd pick it up. We were using it at home. We assumed you'd pick it up. And I said, but you used to use it to talk about us in. They would go off and whisper to each other in Timni, so we didn't understand. They were saying, oh, look, that useless child, you know. But what I did when I wrote Ancestor Stones, which was all set through the lives of these fictional women, but still I had to do my research because this wasn't something you could find in the library, the lives of women living in the 1920s, 30s in Sierra Leone in villages. You couldn't do it in a library. So I went and did the research. But the first thing I did was learn Timni. It was just sort of towards the end of the war, and my mother was a refugee in Sierra Leone, and she lived with me, and we used to go on these long. When I say my mother, I mean my stepmom, because I just regard myself as having two mothers, my Sierra Leonean mother and my Scottish mother. But we used to go on these long walks. And Timni is a language that then did not have an orthography, didn't have a complete orthography. So there were no textbooks for me to look at. There was, I just had to figure it all out orally. And the only languages I had any knowledge of were French and Spanish, Romantic languages. So I just used the rules of grammar from those languages which more or less applied. I mean, the only thing that they didn't apply with were the plurals, but they more or less applied. So I learnt Timni, but I was never going to learn to speak it well enough. I was speaking baby Timni, really. But I then worked with my cousin. I have a cousin, Mshai, who appears in almost everything I write at some point or another. And he's worked very, very closely with me over many years. He'd worked on The Devil That Danced on the Water with me. And so he did all the translation. But the other thing I did was that I recorded all of the interviews. So, by this time I knew enough Timni to hear the answer I was getting, right? And then I had Mshai's translation to help me. And then what I did with the voice is very, very important to me, and we may have run out of time to talk about voice, but I spend a lot of time trying to create the voice on the page, whether it is a Croatian peasant or a Sierra Leonean village woman, or a psychiatrist from Ghana. I spend a lot of time trying to create the voice. And so what I did in order to create the voice of these women was I listened to the tapes over and over again in Timni until I got the musicality. And there's also a way of speaking, a rhythmic way of speaking, where people come back to the same phrase and come back to the same phrase. So I attempted to render this on the page. And sometimes, I had to make stylistic and aesthetic choices. Sometimes it didn't work. Like the constant repetition just became annoying on the page, frankly. But, I would put in a little bit. A nod to it. But what I was really listening for was the musicality. And some years, a couple of years after the book was published, but some years ago, I was having dinner with a musicologist, and she said, I read that book and I began to tap out parts of the prose, and she said it does have this very, very, very distinct and quite complicated rhythm to it, which is the rhythm of Timni. And there were other choices I made, like Timni is a very consonant-heavy language, so I tended to use consonant-heavy English words, choices of English words, rather than those with long vowel sounds. So it's an aesthetic rendering of a language on the page.
Wow. So when we talk about the labor of writing, that's a great question, thank you. I know we're at time, and so what I want to ask you as a last, not as a last question, but as a pause question. You're here in Kenya, and I know I heard you say on the first day, if I didn't miss it, that you're working on something that is in conversation with Kenya and being in Kenya? And if you do not mind, saying a little bit about the project you're working on now.
Okay, well, I've been here for months, actually, over the last few years.
Thank you, Mudhoni.
Yes, thank you, Mutoni. I was here for 2 months last year. I've been here for 6 weeks already this year. I'm here again. I'm staying on after the festival. And I'm actually, and you talk about my switching genre a lot, this is another work of non-fiction, and it is about the ecology and history of the Rift Valley, of the Great African Rift Valley. So in February, I was up in Ethiopia in a place called the Afar, the Danakil Desert, which is the most astonishing place, sleeping on a volcano. And a few months ago, I was in Tanzania for the migration of the wildebeest. It's nature writing. Nature was really my first love as a kid, actually. I wanted to be a wildlife biologist. And this is the thing I love about being a writer, is at some point you'll get to do it. Just like looping the loop. So I spent a lot of time with some of the most preeminent wildlife biologists and paleontologists and archaeologists in this country and in Ethiopia and Tanzania and elsewhere in the Rift Valley. And the book will be published by HarperCollins in the UK and in Grove Atlantic in the US. And it's nature writing, and I sometimes say it was my first love. It's just that a dictatorship, a civil war, and a murder stood in my way. But now I'm finally back to what I loved in the first place.
Thank you very, very much. Ladies and gentlemen, citizens of Macondo and of East Africa, Aminatta Forna. Thank you so much for this great conversation. Please get the books. Let me just remind you, there's The Devil That Danced on Water. I know one I've seen a lot of people seem to have is The Memory of Love. Don't laugh at how mine is dog-eared. Then there is Ancestor Stones. And there is a way in which those three are in conversation and, believe it or not, also in conversation with The Hired Man, which is set in Croatia. Buy the book and you will know how and why. And then also there is Happiness. Where is Happiness? That sounds like a thought. Happiness, which is her latest novel. And then, of course, Notes from a Life in Motion, The Window Seat. Aminatta is still around. You could get the books signed and you can get them at Prestige.